one of this session, which is called Approaches to Past Truth and Historical Records, Resonance in the Present. We will have two speakers. Professor Iftikhar Dadi from Cornell University. He is a professor of transnational art history and focusing on modern and contemporary art from South and West Asia. And our second speaker will be Wendy Scho. She's an art historian and researcher. She has published on late Ottoman art and art in the early Turkish Republic and on Islamic art. So please, Iftikhar, you are the first to speak.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Hamid Kashmir Shikan, for bringing us together. So when Hamid asked me to, invited me to present, I mentioned to him that although I have done work on the Middle East and North Africa, I didn't have anything currently but I did have some material on South Asia I could present, and Hamid kindly agreed to let me present on that as a way to perhaps think about methodological and comparative insights. Okay. But among the things, so I am interested actually in, of course, I'm interested in South Asia and MENA region, but I'm also interested in methodologically thinking them together in various ways. And a recent publication that I was co-editor of is this Art and Architecture of Migration and Discrimination, which came out last year with my colleague at Cornell, who's an architectural historian, Esra Akchan. And this looks at, basically this is a collected and edited volume, and it's in two parts. The first part looks at the mid-20th century and looks at the consolidation of nationalism in Pakistan and Turkey and all the horrible thing that it entails, okay, and the exclusionary kind of narratives it entails. And the second looks at basically migration to Europe, okay. So we look at Berlin in the case of Turks in Berlin, and then Pakistanis in London. Okay. So it's an edited volume, and our focus is on the humanities, and so it's on art history and architectural practice, architectural insights as well as literary kind of and cinema. Okay, so. So one of the things I want to think about when I look at this material is to both look at kind of the artists I'm going to look at, but also the how we how these what we look at also intervene into the discipline. So in this case, I'm trying to think through the notion of the avant-garde in relation to, let's say, the global South, okay, but especially in the case of South Asia. So the historical avant-garde during the first half of the 20th century in Europe grappled with and situated itself against the powerful legacy of realism in literature and the visual arts. However, these conditions were never fully present in South Asia. So my contention is that for the avant-garde to arrive in a specific context requires either the persistence of, in the case of Europe, academic cultural forms that carry congealed sort of meanings that could be critiqued for their lack of alignment with current sensibilities, or institutional or sedimented understandings of history and society via representational modes that nevertheless fail to address the transforming character of what they refer to. Generally speaking, in South Asia and in much of the post-colonial world, academic visual arts during the modern era never acquired canonicity as form. In the realm of history, however, the visual culture associated with contestary and kind of monumental events such as the partition of South Asia have by now assumed a kind of a representational veracity and therefore can become subject for a kind of an avant-gardist revisitation, okay? Many contemporary artists have consequently developed work that critically re-examined the visual truth of the partition. As Geeta Kapoor has noted in another context, and I quote, "Even when qualifying the practice of art and acting as concept and event rather than as a sequence in history, the contemporary is always, of course, imbricated in the historical process. So really thinking about the responsibility, if you will, of contemporary art in terms of its own trajectory, in terms of its formal unfolding, but also its kind of relationship and responsibility to history. This essay consequently situates the salience of the avant-garde for South Asian art through a single case study by analyzing the work of a contemporary artist that disturbs the veracity of these seemingly settled partition representations. Despite having transpired 7 decades ago, the partition continues to reverberate in the lives of so many of those who did not witness 1947 firsthand, yet who remain captivated by its complex after effects. So the partition I'm talking about is the 1947 departure of the British from colonial India and the division of colonial India into post-colonial states of India and Pakistan, accompanied by a lot of bloodshed and a very massive migration that is seen to be the largest migration in human history, right? Okay. So these include so despite having transpired 7 decades ago, the partition continues to reverberate in the lives of so many who did not witness 1947 firsthand, yet who remain captivated by its complex after effects. These include the persistence of second and even third order memories inherited from the first generation and from literature, film, photography, the psychic awareness of the dispersal of familial structures and friendships across hostile borders, and the loss of affective ties to specific places associated with familial memory. Above all, today, it's a synecdoche for the uncanniness of the contemporary encounter, the pull of intimacy, as well as the struggle to come to terms with unfamiliarity, with the diverse others inhabiting the vastness of South Asia in an era when exclusivist nationalism and identitarian claim are actually becoming even more dominant, right? Okay, so let me begin by looking at basically early, if you will, kind of poetic critiques of the partition. So this was a poem called The Dawn of Freedom, written by the noted leftist poet Faiz Ahmad Faiz, who wrote it in 1947. Okay, and it's a poem in Urdu, and it's called Subha Azadi, and the first verse begins with Ye Daag Daag Ujala, right? This dawn stained by which is marked by a blemish or a stain, right? Daag, I think those who know Persian would understand that it's a kind of a mark or a blemish or a kind of a damage, right? So these are just some excerpts. These tarnished rays, this night smudged light. This is not the dawn for which, ravished with freedom, we had set out in sheer longing. And so, in other words, there was a quest that people had, and the quest did not, ended up in this highly compromised and damaged kind of, freedom, right? And it ends with, friends, come away from this false light. Come, we must continue our search for that promised dawn, right? So this was actually, in the, let's say, in the very charged events of the partition, this poem marks, let's say, an affective and a poetic response to, and a kind of an uncertainty with the reality that is developing and, at that time, right? So it's a prescient poem, I think. It's a sense of very disappointment, of dreams betrayed and unrealized. And at the end of the formal process of decolonization, the dawn that was promised by political independence did not result in a new day bathed in a clear and limpid light, but was tarnished. Okay, the poem perceptibly suggests that the subsequent trajectories of South Asian nation states will remain freighted by the hindrances of the colonial and pre-colonial eras rather than marking a clear break from them. Nevertheless, in much of the poem, Faiz celebrates and affirms the difficult and consequential journey of fellow travelers towards a utopia vividly evoked by metaphors of classical Urdu poetry. And he ends with a fraternal call to continue the excursion. He says, "Chale chalo ke wo manzil abhi nahi aayi," right? So continue the journey because the manzil is still, awaiting, right? Okay. Now, a number of artists, visual artists who experienced the partition did kind of make work about it. And these are names like Satish Gujral and Tayyib Mehta. But they were modernist, and they approached it only in kind of metaphorical and indirect ways for the most part. However, contemporary practice in a growing number of South Asian artists, who actually most of them did not experience the partition, is now beginning to grapple with the latent complexity of these partition effects, which extends from the grand nationalist and geopolitical and identitarian agendas into the most personal and intimate aspects of the self. In some ways, contemporary cultural and artistic practice is uniquely placed to address this second-order predicament, as it executes a modality of address that seeks neither metaphorical sublimation nor adherence to established artistic form nor legitimacy with the national modern. The contemporary work of art is, it's not a it does not offer transcendence in a way that the modernist project attempted to do. And it doesn't also attempt to redeem events and crises into utopian kind of, let's say, distilled sublimations. Rather, it kind of refuses claims to authenticity and insistently maps the multiple dislocations and antinomies of the social field. Contemporary art arguably can provide us and with successive generations with intellectual and affective resources to rethink our stances. And these efforts may address immediate conditions, or they may be latent, proleptic, or prophetic. From this perspective, it does not matter whether this art is accessible or difficult, how widely the work circulates, or what the specific identity of the artist is. Contemporary artists from South Asia and its diaspora continue this journey, producing creative and unexpected works in diverse media that address individual and collective dilemmas of South Asia. And they offer critiques of the present that remains weighted down by narrow identitarian affiliations, and prefer a generous vision of a future in which independence, equality, and fulfillment of human potential can, ought to find a better and more universal realization. Okay, so now I'm going to look at the work of a single artist, okay? This is an artist who actually engages with the photographic record of the partition, which you see here in the case of the most well-known photographs taken by Margaret Bourke-White. Margaret Bourke-White is a Cornell University graduate, so I have a special interest also in terms of my own university to think about this work. One might imagine that because the partition happened in the full light of history during the mid-20th century, and since it marks such a monumental series of events, one would find a variety and profusion of photographic evidence documenting its complex dimensions. However, what circulates instead is an extremely limited number of images. While there are numerous photographs of leaders engaged in negotiations or addressing masses of people leading up to the partition, by contrast, the few photographs of ordinary people, migrants, refugees caught in its maelstroms have been taken primarily by Western photographers, which included Cartier-Bresson and most notably Margaret Bourke-White. These were published not in South Asia, but as photo essays in American magazines such as Life, and they have by now achieved a kind of a status, canonical status, right? Today, one seeks visual evidence of the partition in terms of everyday life. One encounters only this small body of photographs, and one struggles to reconcile the powerful yet fragmentary and limited scope of this archive with the tremendous scale of widespread violence and physical and psychic displacement that the partition engendered. Now, the artist I'm going to look at is an artist whose name is Imran Channa. He's a mid-career artist who lives now in Amsterdam. His engagement with the photographic archive of the partition unearths key issues in the questions of remembrance and narration of history. Channa translates archival photography into abstraction. This is accomplished through a rigorous practice of drawing and erasure. So what he's going to do is that he's going to take, he's going to take photographs. So he has two set of archives. One is the Margaret Bourke-White photos, right? And the second are his family photographs from, he grew up in a small village in Sindh, which is an impoverished area. And these are just very ordinary photographs of his family or him hanging out, with his friends. Okay, so they're kind of very ordinary, kind of everyday images. And he's going to mix them up. So sometimes you cannot tell where he's drawing from. But in the case of the Margaret White photos, so for example, this one, what he's going to do is that he's going to make a pretty faithful drawing, and then he's going to destroy it, okay? And he's going to destroy it in 3 different ways. So let me talk about that. Okay, central concerns of Channa's extended investigation revolve around the question of historical truth associated with the photograph, and our understanding of history remains malleable to kind of, let's say, ideological blandishments despite the ostensibly stubborn veracity of photographic evidence. If even the most reliable visual artifact in the archive cannot guarantee truth, how can we situate ourselves as subjects of history? These questions are absolutely central to subjectivities in South Asia today as we individually and collectively seek a responsible relation to our history beyond the siren song of exclusivist post-colonial nationalisms. Now, since its inception in 1839, photography has been associated with this unparalleled truth claim, arguably much more so than other kinds of, let's say, cultural artifacts, and even accounts such as written accounts of history or history paintings. The photograph has been seen to provide a measure of indexical truth that is manifest and visible, and this is a widely accepted conviction that has paradoxically not weakened even in our era of Photoshop manipulation. One way to understand this continued force of this belief is by theorizations that locate the photograph as an indexical medium. Just as the fingerprint is an index whose presence guarantees the very person whose fingerprint is recorded was not only present but physically pressed a part of their body to leave a trace, similarly, the photograph as index is also an artifact created through a direct impression of whatever is placed before the camera lens. As soon as the exposure is made, the photographic negative faithfully records the presence of whatever is in front of it, a landscape, an object, or a person, of course framed by camera placement, choice of lens, exposure time, etc. But even if the photograph was staged or set up in such a way that it creates an image that departs from reality, nevertheless, the final photograph is nothing other than a material and mechanical tracing of all those actions performed in its fabrication and making, which is its truth, right? So the camera cannot lie, or the photograph cannot lie, right? Also, the photographic field of view does not make distinctions between objects placed in its view and records all whatever is in front of it without hierarchy, producing a powerful set of responses associated with a kind of realism. John Berger had famously said that the photograph cannot lie, but he immediately qualified it by observing, by the same token, it cannot tell the truth, or rather the truth it tells is a limited one. This is because a photograph is nothing but an artifact that freezes a moment into a flattened rectangular space and disconnects this rectangle from the ceaseless flow of time. It can never be equaled or synchronized with the fullness of actual presence. Even in the most saturated instances of photographic ubiquity, we have but a finite number of photographs taken from selected angles at discrete and discontinuous moments in the continuous flux of time. The photograph thus provides us only with fragments, or a kind of social hieroglyphs, whose meanings individuals and societies continue to strive and fabricate and secure later. To create these new significations for legibility, the photograph must be immersed in a new discursive context, quite different from its originary space-time continuum. And this necessary act of reinscription is also where the meaning of the photograph is reworked. Okay, now let me show you his procedure. So he has 3 series. This is the eraser on paper series. So in which he, erases the work, so you have very faint impressions of the work. Here's another instance. So this is the original photograph. And you can see that he's also recording the damage to the photograph in terms of the, let's say the punctum, the Barthian punctum, if you will, right? That Hamid Dabashi had also invoked. In the error series, he's going to smudge the photograph. So he's going to have, this is the original archival photograph, right? And this is the in-between stage on the left, and what you have at the end is kind of a smudging, okay? And here's another instance, okay? And this is another, and this shows you, and this is the third way of destroying the photograph, which is to draw it and then to continue to draw it until it becomes a what you get is the image on the right. And these are all the processes, by which he is kind of, in a sense, developing the work. Okay. So in Memories, both archives, in his own personal archives and also the partition photographs are deployed, but in such a way that it becomes impossible to identify their source. So in the case, especially of these memory series, we don't actually know whether these are, you only get this, so you don't know whether let's say the image, the reference image was the partition image or one of his banal family images, okay? And sometimes you get them in this kind of a juxtaposition, okay? Now, Channa bases much of his work of these iconic photographs of the partition. His process is that all three series involves first producing large-scale drawings using a dark pencil, such as a 9B, to create an enlarged realist image faithfully based upon the archival photograph. After the drawing is completed, he practices a laborious process of erasure and reinscription, effacing the legibility of the original image. And in my interview with him, he said, I have to make it really, it should hurt me. It should be painful for me to erase the image, right? So the physical, the bodily exertion is very much part of the process of making this work. This process of erasure is extremely arduous. It involves very considerable effort and is physically painful on the muscles and fingers of the artist. This sense of bodily involvement, pain, fatigue, as Channa reworks and erases the image, creates an embodied act of creative destruction leading to a new kind of inscription, which insists on the necessity of the substrate image, even as it seeks to question its veracity and its positivist transparency. Channa, of course, cannot give us the truth of the partition or even of his own personal past. Instead, these works offer another kind of evidence, that of continued psychic disturbance that is produced when history, in large and small ways, is remade and in turn molds our lives, and how this process of fabrication is ceaselessly and continually inflected by power and ideology. On seeing Channa's projects, one is reminded again of Geeta Kapoor's suggestion that, and I quote, "a contemporary poetics will track invisible paths where signs of descent stray and regather into metonymic relays. The very frisson between poetics and politics will convert combustive energies, internal and external, into an avant-garde position," end quote. Erasures and reworkings are handled by the artist in these three different ways that I explained. How much time do I have?
6 minutes.
Okay, that's fine, yeah. Okay, so let me just talk about this body, right? So, which is that one of the ways that this body of work is made is that the erasure is done so that you get this kind of striations, as you can see, right? So in other words, it's erasure done horizontally, okay, in layers, so that you get these kinds of striations, which also then reminds you of kind of, let's say, kind of electronic media imagery, right? So there's a way in which these historical photographs become kind of reinscribed and come into dialogue with both, let's say, the newspaper photograph, but also then, what you might see on TV with the scansion lines, okay, and so on, right? Okay. So in Memory series, the act of erasure proceeds not towards evacuation and lightness, but towards density and opacity. The work is methodologically erased in regularly spaced steps with an assistance of a ruled surface, so using a ruler to kind of, in a sense, guide his horizontal movement. The first erased drawing, which still retains a smudged original image with vertical or horizontal orientation, is then redrawn and erased again, a process that is repeated several times until the masked, dense black outlines are interrupted by striations of horizontal or vertical patterns, endowing the heavily worked final image with instability and dynamism. Unlike the faint ghostly shapes in the eraser and paper series, so that would be, this first erasure, where you get a kind of an evaporation of the image, if you will, right? The character of the mechanically produced image, you get something like this, which looks like a mechanically produced image, but one that is abstract. The tension between the regularity of the striations and the primeval organic shapes of the masked forms underneath can be allegorized as the tension between the individual lives, that are caught in modern ideological regimes that grind on. And the gyres of history continue to turn ceaselessly over the bodies and lives of individuals and communities. Moreover, in these works, the personal archive is equated with the historical archive. This correspondence suggests that even one's own personal memory is not secure, but is open to a process of reinscription that lies beyond one's own conscious perception. I'll end by also repeating Hamid Dabashi's invocation of allegory as a kind of a, in his talk yesterday, he really stressed the question of how allegory becomes a kind of a mode by which many artists look into history and into the present. And I think for me, my reading of Channa also, in a sense, is aligned, okay, in terms of reading it via allegory. So I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you, Iftikhar. We will now listen to Wendy's show, and thank you for respecting the time so
I'm going to, right at the beginning, I'm going to show a video, and I want to, before you start it, wait, okay. One thing.
Yes.
I want to, may I?
Yes.
Just something really quick. I want to erase the slide that I want to show, given everything I've seen. But I don't seem to have it here. Okay. I don't see the slide that I erased, so I can't unerase it. Do I have it? No. I have so many versions of this. But yeah, so I'm going to be starting out, and where do we have the view? I would like to have presenter view. Where's presenter view? Reading.
I think maybe if you look at outline.
No,
that's not.
It's the view when we show the slideshow. There it is.
You have to look at the. No, look at view.
No, it's slideshow. It's on slideshow usually. Present. Normally one has presenter view. Where is it? Use presenter view. Perfect. Right.
You will have that on there anyway.
Okay.
So you will have. So I'll just do the slideshow. I'll start from the beginning.
Perfect.
And you will have it.
Perfect.
Here.
That's what I want.
You wanted.
Yeah. Thank you so much. All right, hello, thank you very much, and thank you all for these magnificent presentations. It's been such a lovely conference. Thank you very much to Hamid and to Fatima for organizing it and for including me in it. And yeah, I'm going to be talking about a very sort of long absence, which is that of writing and the issue of the trace and the way in which the trace of Arabic and Persian legacies have in certain ways persisted in Turkey's loss of script in the 20th century. So I'm going to start out with a video, not a video, a film, a short film, that was made by one of the first, he wasn't the first art historian of the Republic, but he was probably the first major art historian born during the period of the Turkish Republic, whose name is Sezer Tansu, and he was born in 1930. This is an animation that he put together based on calligraphies that were in the Museum of Turkish and Islamic Arts, and he put this together when he was around 40 years old, which is also the year I was born. So I'm going to play this for you, and hopefully it'll all work. Accept all.
At Pure Gym, get all the flex you need with no contracts, 24/7 access in most gyms, top quality kit, and unlimited.
Bu ne amentü.
I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay.
Gemisiydi ki yürümezdi. Vavlar soluya soluya kürek çekti.
What is this ship of Amentü that wouldn't go?
Bu ne amentü gemisiydi ki yürümezdi. Vavlar soluya soluya kürek çekti.
The waves rode breathlessly.
Bu ne amentü gemisiydi ki yürümezdi.
What
Vavlar soluya soluya kürek çekti. Hazreti Ali'nin yüreği titredi. Ya hak okunu gerdi.
the
Ya
soul
hak oku varıp yüreği deldi.
the soul of
Ah minel aşk dedi.
Ali shook,
Gözlerinden yaşlar indi.
and so he pulled the arrow of
Amentü gemisi
righteousness
yürüdü gitti.
that pierced the heart. I don't remember the rest, but you get the idea, and then the
Stop
boat
wasting your
could
time
move
with
on.
methods like e-commerce, trading,
now we
and
can get rid of
SMMA.
this.
If you're serious about making money online, then you need
I
to
don't
learn
know
to
how to
spot
get
the
rid of this.
opportunity
I messed
of
up
today. I'll give
completely.
it to you in 2 words.
Sorry. Okay, so we're back to my talking about this. There's obviously an immense amount that can be said about this video. We could talk about his use of imagery that's very Islamic, somewhat Shiite, in a country which identifies itself as post-Islamic Sunni. Right. We could talk about the playful animations that make the animals come to life for an audience that cannot read. And I just want to emphasize, he was born in 1930. My mother was born in 1938. My mom was always taught the Arabic alphabet was too hard to learn, and therefore she never learned it very well. She learned Ottoman later, but there's a whole lot of ideology that's pressed onto the difficulty of Arabic, the oldness of Arabic, and so on. And this was shown on public television in the 70s. I think also his role as an art historian and the question of how do you communicate art history for a history, the language of which has been foreclosed, because Turkish went through not just an alphabet reform, but what's less known is it went through a so-called purification process in which all of the Arabic and Persian that was in it was sucked out, and a lot of artificial language was put in, that actually Klingon, which you know from Star Trek, was actually based on Turkish grammar, because it is the most regular language in the world, because it is largely an artificial language. Weird fact. Okay, so where does this image come from? What's going on with this? I'm not quite going to talk about these aspects of it, but the way in which this engagement with the legacy of lettrism or hurufism has functioned into the contemporary world. So first, where do we come with this? Here we see this image of a galleon, and I'd like you to take a look at it or double take at it, which is, what do we see here? On the one hand, we see a galleon. We see a representational image of a European ship associated with trade. So what you might imagine that the Arabic script superimposed on it might mean is something about the ship. Not exactly. This is a statement of creed which also works in the names of the 7 sleepers, which are alluded to but not named in the 18th surah of the Quran. Okay, so this image has a double function, one of which is it's an apotropaic device for the Ottoman Navy. Right? So it uses the image of a ship, please don't sink. We are, God, don't sink our ship. It's an apotropaic device. At the same time, this ship of Amentu is, as far as I know, and please somebody correct me if I'm wrong, it's a purely Turkish thing, because Amentu is a mnemonic device for knowing what prayers to tell when you don't know Arabic and Persian, when you don't know Arabic. So it's Amentu, is it the same? It's Billah, yeah. It's like, and so this is supposed to give a mnemonic device for somebody who's praying. And so there's both an apotropaic and a mnemonic aspect to this text, which you don't have to read to understand. And of course, that's very evocative in the post-1928 era, when people were no longer taught the alphabet. Now, what becomes even more confusing with this is that these 7 sleepers, this surah of the Quran, is actually one of the portions of the Quran that comes from pre-Islamic texts. Specifically, it is from a 3rd century Syriac liturgy, which has become one of the most important aspects of the Quran in the 18th surah, which is used as part of the Friday readings. Okay, so the image is confusing because we, as people in an art historical tradition, expect a meaningful connection between image and text, and it denies us that. Right? It gives us an image and then something else on top of it, which makes it, illegible, or there's a conflicted legibility. So this is the identification of this image. Okay, so I want us to keep in mind that this cut between the image and the text was perhaps nowhere more dramatically embodied in writing practices than the Republic of Turkey, where 5 years after its foundation in 1923, the Arabic script was scrapped, and Latin script was adopted in 1928. And this is an extremely famous picture of the founding president of Turkey, Mustafa Kemal, who was given the moniker Ataturk in 1934 by Parliament, standing at a blackboard and symbolically teaching the country their letters. Although hailed very ideologically as a victory for increased popular literacy, it of course represented a dramatic shift in cultural capital. While those who knew most foreign languages, particularly French, continued to be able to read and write in the new world order, those with traditional educations suddenly became illiterate. Just as importantly, citizens of Turkey from then to the present lost their literary heritage, becoming foreigners to their own past. Imagine a world in which you cannot read very easily, unless you have special training, a newspaper from 1927. That entirely changes the politics of understanding the Republic, because it is a specialized knowledge with which you can recognize the foundational years as political. A cartoon that indicates humorously the violence of this period was done by Ramiz, which portrays a dynamic of power and humiliation in the interaction of arbitrary groupings of letters from the 2 scripts as build up to human forms. And these human forms are also part of the Hurufist tradition. Now, what I want to point to specifically is, I'm wondering, is this image, which was hung with the letter Vav. And I'm going to focus on the letter Vav, which you saw in the video a little while ago, that was hung in the Museum of Modern Art that was opened in September 2019 in Eskişehir, Turkey. This work of the Arabic script letter Vav was executed during the ceremony of laying the foundation of the Odunpazarı Modern Museum by the President of the Republic of Turkey, the Honorable Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And as you can see, he has done it in TV shows that wanted to praise him. They were like, look what a great job he's done. Not everybody was so kind about this. And of course, this fits into a legacy of presidents making art of questionable quality. Now, the thing is, while we are laughing about this, I'm trying to figure out how to make this. Oops, I wanted to see. I don't know how to. Oh, here, okay. While we are laughing about this, it's the urban elites who are laughing. We are among the urban educated elites. And the response wasn't always to make fun of this. Just before I move on to talk about this, for those of you who don't know, and I think with this audience, this is probably TMI because we all know this, what is the Vav? Okay, so here's the Vav. It's a letter that says O-U-W-V. And actually, while we were listening to Charlotte Banks' talk, I realized that not only is it the letter that normally indicates the one, Wahid, in Arabic, it also is the letter that indicates the O of they, which Anthony Hussein is using for his work, and the neuter third person in Turkish. Anyway, so it indicates these meanings. That is my name in Arabic script. You can see it in action. It also indicates the notion of the word one. For this reason, it is signifying of the word God, or the idea of God, because it is the one. This is a famous painting of the calligraphy in the wall of the mosque in Edirne. It doesn't have an originating date because it's been overpainted and corrected many times. This is a photograph which is also important to keep in mind because it was done by a very important Armenian, Ottoman then Turkish photographer by the name of Ara Güler. So in a very subtle way, it's also a mention of the multicultural identity of the Ottoman Empire that has had a lot of difficulty being commuted into the contemporary limitations of the idea of a nation state. Okay, so trying to get us, there we go, no? There we go. So for people who are pro-Erdogan, this issue of the Vav became a meme. So the long line letter is the Elif, and it says, the leader who stands straight like an Elif and bows like a Vav before God. So his writing of the Vav became an expression of internal virtue. Now, what's interesting for me here is I remember way back when the Istanbul Modern Museum opened in 2004, he gave this talk that was bizarre, and I couldn't find any records of this. I looked and I couldn't, pre a lot of internet stuff. But I remember him saying vividly, I don't really understand this kind of thing. Like he's doing it as president, modern art, whatever. By 2019, there was a counter opening, and this counter opening happened in a context, and I'm like totally not remembering the name, and I'm embarrassed that I'm not remembering the name. But the Istanbul Biennial was opening at this time, and there were immense protests at the Istanbul Biennial because a very important businessman who has been supporting multiculturalism in Turkey was under arrest, and his name is Orhan. Call it out for me, please. Say the name that I'm not thinking of. Anybody? Pardon me? Thank you. I mean, I'm just drawing a blank, and I shouldn't be drawing a blank, and I used to have a slide of it, and now I don't, and, so forgive me. But I didn't want to exclude that there was a huge protest going on about his arrest at Istanbul Modern, and particularly in this context, I really wanted to mention that because he remains in prison. Osman, thank you. Osman Kavala, thank you. I was just like not drawing a blank. Osman Kavala, thank you. And so,
not just a businessman, because he was also an art patron.
Absolutely. I just wanted to, reintroduce that because I think in this context it's really important to mention him and to think about his continuing incarceration, which is, there's a lot to be said about that also because he was very involved with also negotiating his work with the state. So it's a very complicated, Okay, so he is opening a museum in Eskişehir, which used to be a largely leftist city. It's a workers' city. And he says, with knowledge of identity belonging particularly to us, right? So he's making a claim on national identity. We cannot achieve any of our goals with a generation whose mind and spirit has come under the control of other cultures. Right? So he's reaffirming modern art as a mode of producing a national identity unique to Turkey. So he's also reaffirming the Turkishness of Turkey that's embedded in the kinds of language reforms that excluded Persian and Arabic from the formerly syncretic language of Ottoman Turkish. The comparisons between the person and the body shared in these memes and the cartoon we saw earlier are far from incidental. They draw on a 14th century practice of understanding the hidden meanings of letters symbolically with reference to the body. This practice, known as hurufism, which means letterism, became popular for the spiritual edification enabled by the tenuous relationship between multiple modes of representation and vision. So the cartoon and the meme repeat the mode of expression between image and text that we saw in the cartoon, as well as in the image of the galleon superimposed with writing. Sorry, this thing is a little bit confusing. The invocation of the writing tradition, in particular Erdogan's use of the vav, can be understood in terms of the idea of a sensational form. So we see the form, we don't necessarily have to read it. In performing the writing of the vav, Erdogan taps into the worldview of the sensual form invoked by Arabic script, much as his supporters who circulate the memes use the same sensational form to express admiration. So these are examples of this popular calligraphic renditions of the complete man, related to the thought of Ibn al-Arabi, which is often also understood as a composite image of the Prophet Muhammad and the Prophet Adam. Okay. So we can understand Erdogan's vav more clearly by contextualizing it in two broader frameworks: the tradition of drawing the vav and the tradition of writing as a trace of the virtue of the writer. As we already saw, associations with mystical approaches to the divine make it a common visual element associated with worship, as in these mosques. It is often also popular associated with the form of the fetus and the believer bowing in prayer to the divine, as we saw with the meme, as well as obedience to those who have professions of responsibility that start with the letter Vav. This popular lithographic print from 1906, as I mentioned, functions as a mnemonic memory device for frequently used portions of the Quran, assembled in the form reminiscent of a boat with rowers, each indicated by the letter Vav, that has remained popular and well known even into the Republican era, when fewer people were able to read it. Now, of course, this has shifted again since the 2000s as more people have received religious educations. But in order to say whether or not they can read it, we'd have to look at the content of that education, because a lot of it is memorization-based, not comprehension-based. It has also become a popular decorative item among conservative leading middle classes in Turkey. Thus, Erdogan's drawing speaks to a popular contemporary mass aesthetic that draws on popular renditions of Sufism. And I think it's really interesting to think of the Berlin-based artist Esra Ersan's Possible Histories, where the main character of her animation experiences the attack of letters that have lost meanings across time, which is one of the deep losses addressed in her engagements with history. The loss of the alphabet, as well as the complex, layered language, poetry, literature that went with it, leaving the past illegible, both in terms of its written materials and in terms of the blending of religion with the everyday. While Erdogan references the past by drawing the Vav, his performance of writing differs meaningfully from tradition. He performed his letter with a brush on canvas at an easel instead of with a reed pen on a table on paper, as traditionally practiced. While a revival of tradition is promoted through the foregrounding of artists like this writer, I don't want to use the word calligrapher for specific reasons, Hasan Çelebi, this is not the mode chosen for his performance. And I think this is meaningful in that Tayyip Erdogan is in a syncretic performance in which he's painting on canvas a Western medium, and he is writing the Vav badly. He's not natural to the Vav. And in that, he's communicating this desire for / discomfort with that popular audiences can identify with. We can't write the Vav properly, but we wish to be able to write the Vav properly. And there's a sacrality that's involved in maintaining Arabic as something unreachable. One can see this sort of movement towards the Neo-Ottoman as part of this period, as part of Muhteşem Yüzyıl, which is a huge popularization of what's often understood as the apogee of Turkish history and this Ottoman history. See, interesting slip. The past, of course, is irredeemable. Popular series like Magnificent Century reinforce the sense of history with no awareness of the cosmopolitan complexity of the Ottoman Empire, in which Turks were not rulers but peasants. Right? So it's a neo-Ottomanism which is cleansed of the multiple ethnicities that long inhabited this area, including Greeks, Armenians, and populations who continue to be oppressed in Turkey, such as Kurds. Although ridiculed by elites for his apparent failures, this performance is not comic but pensive, perhaps even vulnerable. In contrast to the experienced father figure of Ataturk leading us forward to learn the alphabet, here we have insecurity. Now, this very lack of skill that he shows that made secular viewers mock him suggests that he shows something else, not his skill as a writer, but a certain kind of virtue. And the reason I'm avoiding using the word calligraphy is because the word that's used in Ottoman is not calligraphy, beautiful writing, which is an 18th century neologism based on Greek, but it's the notion of the trace. And traditionally, one has the trace of the virtue of the calligrapher. So Ibn Bawab says, "Strive that the fingers of your hand will write what is good, so that it will be left behind you in the abode of deception, that is the world. For whatever a man does now will confront him on the morrow when he has to face the inscribed record of his deeds." So this is the person who regularized Arabic writing in ways that are recognizable in the modern period. And this recognition of Khat as beautiful doesn't have a quality that is, this is aesthetic and this is not. It's a matter of engaging with the virtue of the writer, and this is something that's expressed repeatedly in biographers of calligraphers. It's not, they did this line really well, but they were very good people, and this is exposed in their images. And people who collected these calligraphies sought to take in this virtue, by appreciating the writing. This repetitive meditative practice became a form of practice, but also became something understood aesthetically in its own right over time. And this coincided with European development of the idea of lettrism, producing ambiguous meanings of the repeated letter between both the Western practice and here we can see the Iranian artist Charles Hussein Zenderoudi's use of the repeated vav, which may be French lettrism, but it may also be in the Islamic tradition of meshk, which is also, by the way, the word used for a musical improvisation. So there's also a cross-medial notion of this. We can see this in modern Turkish painting. When you look at this painting, this is an artist who's very famous for making portraits, but his father was a calligrapher. And in several of his paintings, he shows calligraphy placed into the background of representational nature morte. And here, using the word nature morte, the alphabet has become dead. It's illegible. And especially in the image I have in the center, we have a cactus which can be read as Allah, or flower, sorry. And he indicates this by showing the calligraphy in the background. So it's something that's been left aside. We can see something similar in the practice of Erol Akyavaş in the 1980s. I'm going through this very quickly right now, as well as the animated words of Kutlu Ataman and the work of Murat Morova, both of which engage with the tradition of homosexuality and homosexuality in the Ottoman realm through the framework of traces of writing. And I will leave you in this regard with a quotation from a book called The Bounty of Lovers from 1454 by Siraj al-Shirazi, who describes the innovations of the writing practice behind Ibn Muqla, one of the innovators, by a quote from the son of the caliph, who is said to have said to his father, "My lover's teeth are in the form of a scene, and his mouth's shape is like a rounded meme." These are the names of letters. I think I have it here. Together, they spell poison, some. Amazing. After I tasted it, there was no doubt. So that's the power of letters. Imagine what the power of letters is when you lose them.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you also for respecting the time, and thank you to both the speakers, of course. And so this leaves us with 20 minutes times for questions and comments, please. The floor is yours. Yes?
Thank you both for incredible lectures. And Wendy, I've been really mesmerized by your presentation. One thing, wow is also has also the notion of link, of tie, and the notion of link and tie is important mainly in the mystical tradition that is also present in what you've been presenting in circular, etc. I don't know whether in Turkish interpretation or in the way it's been presented, this aspect of link, tie, which is also the first meaning of religion, religion as link, is there or not?
Thank you very much for that. It is definitely there in the grammatical use of vav because and is ve in Turkish. However, for a modern Turk, that recognition of that letter as being and is absent. right? Because that's not part of the ways in which we see the language. And I should say, for those of you who don't know me, I'm half Turkish, and I have American names, so I sometimes call... In Germany, I've taken to calling myself the Trojan Turk, because they expect an American, they get a Turk. It's very confusing, apparently. But anyway, so I live in Germany for a while, I have been. Anyway, but so absolutely, but I haven't given any thought to that aspect of the letter in relation to this animation. And I also haven't given a lot of thought to this animation in relation to Cesare Tansu's first work was about the geometries of manuscript paintings. His later and much more famous work was the first compendium of modern art in Turkey, which is extremely Ataturkist in its cast. And partly my second book was very much written with reference to, but also as a critique of the Ataturkist cast of his overview of the art of modern Turkey. So I think of him as very much of his generation in relation to sensing a loss from the Ottoman period while also celebrating the Ataturkist secularism and living through the contradictions of these, which I think is a very common experience among people in Turkey, and it's an environment in which I grew up. So I think for all of us, politics are complex, and I think it's very difficult to criticize people, particularly across time. But I think that that's a tension that he's addressing. And I'm also really interested in this animation in terms of what does it mean when we're teaching things, and this very much has to do with what your talk, when we're using academic language and thereby excluding our own audience. And I think that what this animation does is it uses sweetness, cuteness, humor. It's like I often will start my talks with a fable, or I'll include a lot of poetry, because I think that these direct ways of engaging audiences function better than the descriptive voice that we've been trained to use as academics. So that's a lot of ands to your question, but I really appreciate that comment. Thank you.
It's a question to Wendy. Wonderful talk, fantastic. I wanted to ask you about literature. I know it doesn't cover it entirely, but especially the works of somebody like Ahmed Hamdi Tanpınar and the time regulation.
Magnificent book.
And the fact that, he was completely orphaned at a moment in that change of the alphabet from being someone who wrote in Ottoman to someone who started writing in Turkish, in a language that seemed totally defunct for the people of the time. I mean, meaning the people embracing the new language. And he's gone through a bit of a renaissance today. I mean, kind of. But how do you sort of position writers like that within the context of this whole neo-Ottomanism that is happening? Because, if there is any connection.
I should say I haven't lived in Turkey since 2009. So,
I have.
Okay. I should say that because I'm behind the times. I can't remember Osman Kavala''s name. Things are embarrassing. But in terms of Tanpınar, and for those of you who haven't read his work, it's translated. There are, I think, 2 translations of what's the title of the work again? The Time Regulation Institute. I very much recommend it because it has this beautiful, the whole book is wonderful, but just 2 elements. One of them is the description of the shift in time from the calling of prayer 5 times a day towards that of the clock and this notion of static measurement. And it's really a critique of the bureaucratic state and the way in which time comes to represent the bureaucratic state that operates without an agent. So in that way, I think it connects to the work of Zygmunt Bauman and the way in which this neutralization of bureaucracy and the absence of agency allows for devastation, which is very much an issue of our times. So I really very highly recommend this book. Another wonderful thing is that the bureaucracy that he describes happens in the building that's shaped like a clock. So it's like a very weirdly postmodern book from the mid-50s. I don't remember the exact year. Now, in terms of your question, what I think I've observed, and any other comments are welcome, is that the neo-Ottomanism that I've seen in Turkey has a lot to do with presenting the imaginary of Turkishness, not with the folk, as it historically was, but with the rulers. The Ottomans were kings. And though the Ottomans did not identify themselves as Turks as such, and they spoke this composite language that I would say diffused their regional identity into an elite mix of a very complex language, the demand of a national identity is one that has recouped Ottoman Empire as a Turkish empire. And I think this is also supplemented by the ways in which the historiography of Arab countries has often thought of the Ottoman Empire not as a composite, but as a very distant, ethnically different, which it wasn't close by, but it was a pre-modern empire, which I think came up in Vasif's talk. It wasn't a modern empire. So what I think of neo-Ottomanism, and I think I sort of implied this in my talk, is neo-Ottomanism, please, if we're going to talk about a country in which half the population is Armenian and Greek, let's go for it, right? But it's an imaginary, and because it's an imaginary, it's really much more like Muhteşem Yüzyıl than with the cosmopolitan complexity that was part of Ottoman experience. Not to say that the Ottoman Empire was something really, magnificent in all its aspects, but it had a kind of linguistic and cultural diversity which isn't a part of the general model of the nation state. And in putting it that way, I'm purposefully putting it that way because, again, I'm not the judge of history. Nation states have evolved not because Turkey was bad or this country was bad or that country was bad. The notion of a nation state is one that reduces the multiplicity and diversity. That is what a nation state is, and it's the same process in Spain or in Germany or whatever, France, exactly. But yeah, neo-Ottomanism is a way of giving people a new imaginary of rule, of power, and that imaginary, as in many authoritarian states, comes to replace any actual agency that one might have through other processes. Though these days I'm not so hot on democracy either, given how we're experiencing it. But yeah.
Sorry, my question was a bit similar and has been answered. Maybe I'll add the reinterpretations of the vow and the script that you showed us can be seen by time and space with new ways of thinking and new ways of understanding various causes that had been happening, and a way of seeing also various ways of understanding among empires and various leaders, and a few other ways of just looking at it. Thank you.
I don't know if I have an answer to the comment, but I think that we're in a really interesting moment because someplace like Turkey used to be post-Islamic. It was so-called secular. Now it's post-secular, but also kind of post-neo-Islamic. And where are we? What does that mean? Because there's a desire that I've observed in Turkey that many secular subjects have gone through a phase, I don't know if it's a continuing phase, of looking towards mystical approaches to Islam, finding ways of reintegrating Islam into life without necessarily following the authorities, the authorization that comes through the State Department of Religion, which, as in France, is how religion was historically disseminated in the Republic of Turkey. So one issue that's come up, like, if I'm talking to a taxi driver or something, particularly with Iranian taxi drivers in Berlin. And I say, yeah, I work on Islam, I work on Islamic art. And they're like, I hate Islam. I get this answer a lot. And I'm like, well, I understand that, but do you trust the mullahs to represent Islam? Because I don't. Do I trust every religious leader who comes up and says, I represent? And I think this is issue of how we trust, how we know these extremely powerful ways of thinking called religion. Who do we trust to represent them? And I think that question comes up when we're thinking about the country in which I was born, the United States, and preachers who claim to represent the Christian, and of course their support of Zionism. It comes up in current controversies about the relationship between Zionism and Judaism, and the purposeful mixing of what the meaning of anti-Semitism is. And it comes up in the distancing that many urban elites feel obliged for, educated people feel obliged to perform in relation to Islam, in a world where many of us also are at the same time seeking spirituality. So, we have many places where yoga is the most popular non-religion around. Or in Berlin, I'm obsessed with Buddhas in windows, often in places for foot cleaning and exercise. I mean, at my old gym, there were like images of the Buddha with like weights around him. And I'm actually doing an art project on this. So if you want to send me photographs of the Buddha in strange places, please. But, so there's a very long and winding response, but I think that we're in a period where modernity, as it was given to us in the 20th century as salvation from outmoded ways of thinking, has kind of shown its ugly face. And, that modernity didn't work. So where are we? What are we looking for in terms of guidance? And while we're in a period of immense, unthinkable violence, and we're witnessing unthinkable violence, I think we need to think about how do we deploy the ideologies that we potentially have at hand to bring people together and create communication and do all the things that as academics, I imagine many of us are trying to do. So I don't know if that has to do with the and of the Vav, but also I think, how does one communicate? And for me, this sort of animation is a really interesting start to that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Wendy and Iftikhar, for those presentations. My question is to Dadi, really, regarding what you presented, and you began with this lovely poem of Faiz Ahmed Faiz, and I think it speaks about a new dawn, the promise of a new dawn, and not to base oneself on what was the promise, really. And then, of course, you followed it up with Channa's artwork. The question comes that one deals with the fact that, okay, this has not delivered, which is Faiz Ahmed Faiz. And then again, Channa is talking about the erasure, not to depend upon history and the archive as the source of truth. Between these creative responses, is there any sense of a future which is better than what it was? Is there any kind of a sense that you get that they are offering an alternative vision? Or is it that they leave you with that question and then ask you to build your own? I mean, I'm still at that status that whether they leave you with that question or whether they're actually offering an alternative vision.
Thank you. So it's a very complex question, actually, because they both belong to different generations. Because Faiz was part of the modernist leftist kind of generation, whereas Channa is a contemporary, mid-career artist. So definitely the contemporary artists are not offering solutions, right? They're raising questions. They're probing dislocations. They are looking at fault lines in society, right? It's not their job, or they don't, there's no, and also the other, let's say, problem, or let's say characterization of contemporary art is that there is no more utopianism. There is only a weak kind of utopianism, right? So in other words, in modernism, you had this, like, you know, the work of art is supposed to be this aesthetic, universal utopia, right? That's gone, right? So nobody actually does that. So we are left with a very presentist. I mean, in some ways, contemporary art is quite impoverished, right? In terms of its symbolism, its higher meaning, a sense of transcendence. It really cannot offer, and I think this is the prison we find ourselves with contemporary art, as multifarious and exciting and kind of, let's say, you know, engaging it is. It has, you know, it's moved. Its premises have moved to a register where where we don't have a strong sense of universal utopia, okay, which actually modernism did have, right? Now, for Fez's generation, Fez was very much a leftist. He was part of the Communist Party, so it was very much, you know, he was accused of overthrowing the government and was imprisoned, you know, because of that. It's called the Rawalpindi conspiracy case. So that generation is quite different. I mean, they may have been naive, or they may have not thought through exactly what it meant, but they definitely had a stronger sense of, you know, where you want to move society to. Which doesn't mean that Fez was necessarily the person to do it, right, as a poet and so on. But he's part of this fellow travelers who are kind of thinking along these lines. So just very briefly. Yeah.
I think Wendy wants to.
I just wanted to make one sort of, you were sort of thinking about contemporary art as having this negative space. And I think that's a very productive space. And I just wanted to take a moment to recognize that what we're talking about is transcultural communication in a room where, looking around, many of us, either by work or by our backgrounds, are transcultural. And I think that this moment of not being hopeful for the nation state is the just rewards of the nation state. I'm not into nation states personally. Probably many of you are also not. And so, in a way, this fuzziness and this response to the legacy of the nation state, I think that touches on both of what we were talking about, is a way of thinking about how do we recognize the traumas, such as the ones that were in these images, as part of our histories, without remaining attached to them as our complete identities, especially as so many of us are mobile both in body and in our minds through the increase of communications and social media and transcultural communications. So I think it's not just a negativity, there's a positivity that's potential within that negativity.
Yeah, but what you don't have is new myths, okay, new stories. I mean, I just don't see it, okay, today. And unless you have new myths, new stories, new imaginaries, you're not going to have a future.
Okay. Zaina wanted to ask a question, and then there. And
yes.
Then maybe a last one, because I think we... Yeah.
Thank you for...
By not having new myths, do you mean, is it about utopia? Is it about, what is the thing that needs to happen?
I don't know. I'm part of this generation, so I'm as lost as everyone else. I'm just saying that we don't have we are not able to, if we dwell on trauma, we dwell on, which this conference has largely done, and for very good reasons, okay? That's not going to, I mean, you know, you're reckoning with your present, you're reckoning with dislocations and fault lines in society, which you should do, but how do you move ahead? It's not clear to me.
Zaina, please.
I've got a question to you, Iftikhar. First of all, thank you both for really a wonderful panel, very thought-provoking so far. It's actually, I can't help but draw the comparison between Shana's work on photography and the photograph we have in front of us for the last 2 days, which is, and this is the work of Joanna Hajitouma and Khalil Jurej, who intervene into photography in relation to very stereotypical, you know, tourist photography of Beirut from before the war, to reflect on the war. But they do that through this fictitious character of a pyromaniac photographer who sets these slides on fire. I forgot they invent a whole narrative, a fictitious narrative. But their take is they remove themselves from the photographs and from these images, and their take is more of a, I think
relates to the difficulty of resolving the issue of myth today, their take is very much of a postmodern sort of questioning of truth and representation and history, whereas Shahnaz is actually inscribing his or their own subjectivity within the process of, and talking about that arduous and painful process of erasure, and invites perhaps another way of looking at, another way of looking at that history, at that painful history that might open up something different to the present beyond the postmodern conundrum. Maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah, maybe some kind of arduous practice, a kind of arduous and rigorous practice without a guarantee. I think that's what his practice might suggest to me.
You both actually again. A continuation of that for you, Iftikhar. I'm very interested in Shahnaz because he does two separate things. In some of the photos he's subtracting, and in some he's adding, which are sort of opposites. Are opposites. And do you think do you think is the meaning of that in regards to the partition? Because opposites, but both result in a illegibility of the original of what was there in the beginning. So it all becomes illegible. Sorry, but by two completely opposite methods. I don't know if you can elaborate a bit on that.
Yeah, maybe we can collectively think together about this. I mean, there's an image that evaporates, right? So, and then there is an image that's smudged. There are three different operations he does. There is a smudging, and then there is this striations, right? Which also is a kind of an addition, if you will, right? And you're absolutely right. I mean, in the sense that our relation to kind of, let's say, historical certainties is, either one of surplus or, kind of like gaps and loss, right? It is a gesturing towards kind of, that there is not one relation to the past, but it's a relation that is multiply unstable, right, in various ways. Perhaps. I mean, that might be one way to think about it.
Yes, I think, can we take one, if there is one question?
Yes, mine went very enormous questions, and you just had some enormous ones. Although the more enormous one, in reply to your lack of utopia and so forth, is that it's so moving. We've talked a lot about children and pedagogy today, and I do think we needed to go back in these terrible times as well to the issue of the mother tongue. Mothers are still going to have to teach language and teach reading and writing or whatever, and I think that we don't know what those future generations, what's going to happen, but I do think we need at this moment to think of those mothers. I was going to say much more banally, you did use the word lettrism once, and I don't know if you were just using it or if there was any relationship to the international lettrist movement. And the other thing was, it took me years to discover the word mazara, to do with, little manuscript versions of animals when you weren't allowed to draw animals. And then I encounter it about once every 3 or 4 years, and every time it's spelt in a different way. So I never know how to look it up properly, but there is that whole tradition of drawing figures in calligraphy. So that's a kind of double whammy question, but not one of these big, what is the future holding for us questions.
In terms of the lettrism, definitely it's a double affiliation. One of them is that like the modernist artists in Turkey, the modernist artists in Iran were very much invested in participating with global movements which were identified with Paris. Of course, lettrism was actually created by a Hungarian artist in Paris, Romanian, sorry, which makes it a little bit more complicated because there are multiple issues of center and periphery involved. The idea of hurufism is a much earlier idea, but he can look modern by attributing his work to lettrism. So it becomes ambiguous, and this ambiguity can be used art historically by affiliating him with either or both traditions. Similarly, Parviz Tanavoli, who I also talk about when I talk about this in a longer framework, uses a word which he says it's just a word, it's just a sculpture, and he makes massive sculptures of the word nothing, which also has a very strong mystical connotation. But he says his work is not religious, but he also won't talk about it. So there's an ambiguity that's built into functioning in this middle zone that's transcultural, that can be purposefully misleading, purposefully misread, doubly read, that's indeterminate. And I think that indeterminacy, for me, is a really important space of where the literary happens. That is, if we step outside of the positivistic Panofskian framework of art history, and instead we allow for ambiguity, we step outside of the identitarian mold of definition, and we move more into the kind of ambiguity that's enabled by the writing of the image of the writing. And part of my work has recently been about the image is not forbidden per se, and there are different interpretations of it. That is, one of the things that has happened in relation to the discussion of Islam is the reductive nature of it forbids images. It's a much more complex, temporally diverse, regionally diverse discourse that's about the capacity of the image to contain spirit. I'll summarize it that way. And so the issue of the breath being conveyed through the letter rather than through the image is part of what's happening in the ambiguity between the textual and the representational form that emerges in, I believe, like around the 15th century.
Yeah, can I also take my authority as a chair? But I don't want to say, I would have another reading of the word lettrisme for several reasons, but we can have the discussion.
No, I was just going to say that actually all three of us and Nada Shaboot have written extensively on this, okay? So I urge you to look at our work. Yeah. And
on Horufia, yeah. And we had an interesting... Yeah. No, but we can, I think we have to stop here.
Just
but,
look at our work.
Yeah. You will find it, yeah. And I remember when the first time I met Iftikhar, we had an interesting discussion about Horufia in South Asia and in the Arab world. So anyway, but I think we have to close it. Unfortunately, we have to close this panel here. Hamid, do we have 10 or 15 minutes? 10 minutes. So we are here at 3 o'clock sharp. Thank you. And thank you again for that.